Hello, everyone. This is Professor De Angelo. We're moving on in our podcast series for the early American history course. And today we are going to talk about that ever-present demon in American history, American slavery. And so I've had this conversation several times now where we talked about the idea that sometimes we have to look at historical events and try to restrain ourselves from being judgmental because there's a different kind of mindset, and therefore we have to kind of look at it with fresh eyes or whatever. Slavery is not one of those, and the reason for that is it's quite evident that individuals at the time knew that something was wrong, and were vocalizing that for pretty much from the moment slavery first came to Virginia in 1619. And I would note, by the way, that there are a number of commemorations that have been going on this year in 2019 to solemnly reflect on this very dark chapter in American history. So what we have to look at now is we're going to be going through the 19th century element of the slave narrative. But we have to always keep in mind that this narrative goes all the way back to 1619, and that's just for the American colonies, for the British colonies, and the early United States. But slavery in the Western Hemisphere is very, very, very long. It goes way before Columbus reached the shores of the American continents, and it's something that has plagued humanity for millennia. But what we want to look at here is that unique element that made it American, that made it a lot more racially based than what we've seen in other manifestations of slavery. And so now, all this gets tied into the idea of cotton, which became extraordinarily profitable for Southern planters. Not only did they want to buy more land and grow more cotton, but they had to figure out a way to acquire more slaves. And now, when President Jefferson had outlawed what he was called the American slave trade, this created a demand for domestic slavery. And so what that meant in practice was that the slave population in the South immediately became more valuable. And so in Virginia, it was common for estates to sell slaves downriver, quite literally. And they would sell them off to work in new cotton states of Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi. And so over 1 million slaves are going to be transported from the East Coast states to what was then called the Southwest, so Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi. And, there develops almost like a slave kingdom in the South before the Civil War, and a very distinct type of economy. So when we look at the distinctiveness of the South, the first thing that I'd like to touch on that is not really spoken of directly in this particular chapter is this division between market and traditional economies. So in an earlier podcast, I talked about the rising market economy or the market revolution, which really got started in the very late 1790s and went on into the early 1800s. And as we've studied, the Northeast and the West tended to jump on board here, in part because they did not have much of an established economy in other areas. And so for New England and the West, the new opportunities provided through market economies were very strong. And so the entrepreneurial spirit was very welcome, and so the market economy started to thrive there. The South held on to the traditional economy, which is very agriculturally based. And for the South, there was nothing stronger than cotton. And people talked about how cotton was king. And so they talked about King Cotton in the South. And the reason why we have this is because, tobacco had been the first moneymaker. But, tobacco growing is very harsh on the soil and tends to take nutrients out of the land. And so, farmers had to look for other products besides tobacco. And we've gotten into rice and sugar. Obviously, tobacco was still being done, but indigo was still being grown there as well. Sugar was really dominant in both Louisiana and Florida. Tobacco, of course, remained very strong in places like Kentucky and Tennessee, and still in North Carolina and Maryland and Virginia. But there were some agricultural diversity, and in the first cases were obviously tobacco, which we've talked about, but wheat and corn and other types of grains are being grown. Again, we have to look at what's going on in the South in its, I want to call it interconnectedness, but a lot of non-slave holding farmers in the South still relied quite a bit on the plantation. So a lot of farmers, which are sort of referred to in the hierarchy as yeoman farmers, and these were people who, for a large part of their market, sold their crops to plantations to supplement their internal workings. Most plantation owners tried to grow their own food and then do cotton, but that was not always possible. And so they relied on annual purchases from some of these smaller farmers. Particularly true for swine, mules, and oxen. Mules and oxen were used as, obviously, for pulling wagons and carts and plows and all the rest of it, but swine for food. It was, pretty diverse in the sense that we tend to think of the South as being solely a tobacco growing area, but as you can see just in these few moments, there's been quite a bit of commodities coming out of the South, not just cotton. The reason why we fixate on cotton is really twofold. One is the profit margins on cotton were significant. So people in the cotton market were clearly making better profits than in other areas. And the other was that cotton was the one commodity that was really reliant on slave labor, particularly to make those profit margins even greater. So when we look at the South, again, we tend to look at the South as one large region. And traditionally, when we look at the region historically, we tend to look at it as just Upper South and Lower South. And really, there were three. So what we considered the Deep South or the Lower South really was South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. And that's all sort of referred to as the Deep South. And so these states were renowned for their labor-intensive cotton plantations. But then the second group, which is referred to as the sort of the Middle South, is Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and these are the states that were largely involved in wheat, corn, tobacco growing places. There's also swine and mules and oxen being raised there. The final group, which is what we sort of remember as the Upper South, right, which is Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And these were areas, and if you think about it, when you're going to see these divergent agricultural businesses, and as you go north, you're going to see a little bit more manufacturing, but nothing on the lines that you're going to see in places in the northern parts of the United States. There is some manufacturing that is happening in the South. But this was because they didn't like the fact that they were so reliant on the North for manufacturing and the shipping of their products. So, but there would not be enough to support this. And I think it's important to remember something. Southern agricultural interests, businesses, if you will, these were family-run operations. These were very large plantations or farms or any of those types of things. And the nature of this traditional economy made people very cash poor, but high net worth. So it was quite common for very wealthy gentlemen to find themselves short on cash, particularly as it went closer into the spring, as you got through the winter and into the spring. And a lot of Southern gentlemen lived off of credit. And so the problem with manufacturing in the South is that it was going to be a very high stakes game for a Southerner. If I were a member of the planter class, which is the upper 10% of Southern society, and I was going to endeavor to start a factory, this would have meant selling the land, selling the slaves, accumulating all the capital that one could muster, and literally dumping it all into one industrial venture. Should that fail, there was kind of no turning back. Your family would be basically ruined because your identity as a planter was in many ways dictated by the size of the land that you had and the number of slaves that you owned and the amount of wealth that you could accumulate. And if, it was a very large gamble. And I'm not doing this to sort of make excuses, but rather to examine the rationale. And this is something that we have to do when we study this from a historical perspective. Again, I bring this up repeatedly during the year. People act with a certain type of logic. And we always learn better when we analyze the logic. So while it's easy to kind of point to people and call them evil or denigrate them for the choices that they make, history isn't a very educational process unless we can find the logic that they were using to justify the practice, because then we can hopefully avoid something like that happening again, or at least be able to look at societies that are practicing it and saying, hey, that looks awfully familiar. And so we get into these moments of history which are very difficult to study because it's such an intense measure of inhumanity and cruelty that it's hard for us to fathom and wrap our minds around it. And therefore, we tend to want to be just sort of mad about it and place judgment and move on. But we don't learn much historically if we do that. So if we look here, we can see that the population, right, with cotton production. If you notice this is an unbelievable deal here, right? This is the cotton production in that period of time. And look at this population and notice that there's this unbelievable amount of cotton production, particularly along the Mississippi River Valley, right? They called it the Black Belt because the soil was so fertile. And these are just, this unbelievable amount of, production. And you notice that there are these cities that are just going to start to thrive, particularly New Orleans. New Orleans and Atlanta become the very big urban centers of the South. And so when we look at this society that we have, really a subset of the American political culture, we have this very, very different community that emerges. And as I had stated, the South was very much of an agrarian economy, which I refer to a lot as a traditional economy. And when you have traditional economies like this, economic choices are made through tradition and custom. They're not market-based, meaning they don't respond to changes in consumer behavior, but instead rely on its norms. And so this becomes a society that's very dependent on a hierarchical system. The larger plantation owners, called planters, are going to dominate this society. And they would have usually more than 25 slaves. And beneath them were going to be the smaller plantation owners, obviously less than 25 slaves, many of whom had to work with their slaves. It's not that, and then below them were the yeoman farmers who had no slaves, but were still in the agricultural business. And these were people who really had to struggle because they were competing with the bigger producers. Many of them, as I stated earlier, became supportive agricultural businesses. They sold animals and feed and grains and whatnot to the actual plantations. And so beneath them, of course, were a group called lesser professionals, and they were there to basically support the groups that were involved in this traditional economy. So these were commodity merchants, accountants, lawyers, ministers, doctors, and then beneath them were the landless whites. And then there was a community of freedmen in the South that were really not citizens, but they weren't slaves. And they lived in a very unusual state of limbo. And it is true that some of them did own slaves, but for the most part, they were in very restrictive lives. They couldn't live in certain areas. They couldn't be involved in certain businesses. So it was a rather difficult life. If for those of you who are out there who may trace your heritage back to freedmen, it's a great honor to have done that. But I have to say that their lives were unbelievably difficult. They lived on a razor's edge, and it must have been just unbelievably heartbreaking to try to eke out a living in that environment. But now this culture was very masculine. It was very much based on chivalry and honor, if it were. And so it has to do a lot with this male-dominated agrarian system where the sort of domineering character was seen as virtuous. Now, it's also true that the Southern white male could be quite a charmer. They were raised with a lot of etiquette. There was a great deal of decorum, which they had to abide by. They were unbelievably deferential to women, I should say white women. They were... There's narratives that I've read from people, travel logs and whatnot, and you get this impression that were you to be let's say, traveling through the South and happened to see just an unbelievably beautiful plantation. You can read these narratives where people are doing such a thing, and they go up and just sort of knock on the door and ask if the owner is at home, and if he was, it was just all the stops were unplugged, and they would just be so effusive and generous and kind, and they really could charm just about anyone, and yet they were unbelievably brutal, and so this is no more evident than the life of the plantation mistress. And these are oddly just very difficult positions to be in. These were women who were essentially raised in a very small community. By 1860, there were about 1,300 families in all the South that comprised the planter class. That's a very small group, and they tended to marry within their own circle. So the women would really be raised to be married off, and to marry off in a way that would not bring a negative shadow on the family, and more importantly, to provide each of them with a viable living, because when the father died, the entire estate, everything, the entire fortune went to the eldest son. So, which is very reminiscent of English gentry. And this becomes a rather difficult life for some of these women. And particularly if they were in the old Southwest, which we're referring to now as the Deep South. These were brutal climates, and unbelievable levels of violence. These slaves were treated just unbelievably cruelly, and these women witnessed all this. They themselves were subject to brutal lives. And their masters, their husbands, were not, how would I put it? I mean, they weren't very good at hiding their lust. And for the average white plantation mistress to be confronted by slave children that look a lot like their husband or their son or their nephew, and not be able to say anything about it, was really unbelievable. The group that we refer to as plain white folk are the landless whites. Many of them labored in dockyards and in businesses, but many also did some of the more dangerous labor that plantation owners didn't want to have their slaves do. It sounds unbelievably ironic, but there was some work that was considered so dangerous, particularly if it involved things like dynamite or other problems, to have those plain white folk do it, because if they were harmed or in any way injured or killed, that's their problem. But if a slave was killed, well, that's an investment. Just a very sick and twisted look on life. And so poor whites, you may have remembered in the earlier colonial periods in the South, particularly as people started to move out towards the Appalachians, there arose a number of immigrants, primarily Scots-Irish, who quite literally squatted on lands in what I'm going to refer to as the Trans-Appalachian area. And their descendants are going to be in a rather difficult situation, because they couldn't necessarily take advantage of the large cotton industry was out there because, again, the larger planters were dominating the industry. And they couldn't necessarily compete with slaves for the workforce because how do you beat $0? And so they had to go around and just kind of like find odd jobs and figure out what to do, right? And so when we look at this community, like I said, it's balanced so much on honor and violence. Dueling was still happening in the South when the northern states had long made it illegal. And it was unthinkable, the kind of things that would go on there. And again, this is why we want to study it. What goes through the mind of a person, let alone a person who considers themselves a gentleman, who can, on one hand, act with such unbelievable civility and manners and just be without question, just an incredibly charming individual, and then suddenly break into rage and violence against family and slaves and against, each other. It's just an unbelievable environment. And while it's not necessary to be sympathetic or even empathetic, it's interesting to try to study where some of this dichotomy comes into play, where one could be so obsessed with honor and chivalry and at the same time have absolutely no qualms about just unspeakable violence. For the black community in the South, right, to be a free person of color, which is later going to be called freeman, this image here is a medal. And so it was very important to have this documentation. Medals were a lot more valuable than the paper because obviously papers were more easily lost. These were items that were literally worn around the neck of people. And that's because by 1860, only about 10% of the African population in the United States were freedmen. So it was a very prized status. And, you didn't want to risk being put back into slavery. And that is something that did happen. And you needed that documentation with you at all times. You never, ever would want to be outside of your home without this form of documentation there. Now, the trade in slaves was going on still. There's a tendency sometimes to think that since we outlawed importing slaves in 1808, that somehow this ended the quote-unquote slave trade. But actually, it's something that became more disgusting. So some continued to be traded by smugglers who imported slaves anyway. And I would argue that the enforcement of such rules were probably incredibly lax in the South. And there is quite a bit of coastal area to cover, which was never going to happen in that time period. But obviously, breeding slaves becomes really important. And it's this that becomes the more abominable of all of it, that suddenly female slaves were seen as valuable, not so much because of the work they could do in the field, but by the fact that they could breed you future workers. I mean, it boggles the human mind to dwell there. But these slave traders are going to be part of those lesser professionals in the Southern hierarchy. And so we have a hierarchy that happens within black communities as well. So the difference between a rural slave and an urban one. And then to divide further, there were skilled workers. So again, this harkens back to the idea of a sort of self-sufficient fiefdom. Each plantation was living off of borrowed money, really, a lot of the time. It collected funds once a year when crops were sold. And so for a plantation to, in a sense, maximize its profits, it wanted to make sure that, you wanted to make sure that none of that, as little of that profit left the plantation as possible. So slaves were taught to be carpenters, were taught to be masons, they were taught to be cobblers and coopersmiths and other types of trades. And these guys had a certain amount of status and agency that other slaves did not have. And so they were treated better. Field hands, of course, were common everyday workers. It would sort of be the difference between skilled and unskilled labor, right? They demand higher pay. In the slave culture, those skilled laborers were getting better food. They were getting better treatment. Some were actually, especially in the earlier period, some of them were hired out to other plantations to work. And the money that they earned, the master would often let them keep part of it, which then could be accumulated to buy freedom or to buy certain privileges or commodities that other slaves wouldn't have. And then, of course, there were what we call the household slaves. And they were also skilled laborers. They were obviously dressed better and fed better and treated better. It's an unusual reality, right? The female slaves, as I said before, with the end of importation, women were encouraged to become pregnant by rewarding them with less work and more food. And then once they've had their child, however, they were expected to carry that child with them when they went into the fields. And of course, they just gave birth to a child that was going to see no freedom. I mean, just can't even imagine. And many of these children are going to be the products of rape. This level of hardship, I don't know how you, how that happens and how you overcome it. One way you do this is through culture. Timothy Garton Ash wrote a very interesting piece called Out of Adversity. And he wrote it in context of the communist takeover of Eastern Europe and the unbelievable repression that was going on during the communist, or I should say Russian communist control of Eastern Europe. And yet he examined that there was just this unbelievable outpouring of art and literature and music and drama that was done. Václav Havel is just the one I could think of as eventually becomes the president of the Czech Republic, who himself was a playwright and an underground playwright at that. But this culture kept these civilizations alive under unbelievable repression and horrible, horrible treatment. And we see that again here in the slave culture that emerges in the United States. And, there's something to be said about how if you are a contemporary American and you enjoy music, you better be just grateful for the African community, because it all derives from African Negro spirituals and the level of music that becomes this blues and soul music and gospel and country and western. I mean, it's unbelievable. Obviously, there's a lot of other influences that go in there, but this is the part of the legacy that we all enjoy, this unbelievable expression of art that came from the most unspeakable level of cruelty and violence. And then the last thing that really has to be talked about, and we're going to go into it a little bit more, but there's a tendency sometimes to think of people and see them suffer, and in some ways see them as passive and meek. And yet we really cannot do that here. The slave resistance was very strong. And I want to go over some of that in just a few minutes. But here we go. If we look at the slave population, you can notice here in 1820, so this is going to be around the time of the Missouri Compromise, or just before it. You can see the population of the slaves very concentrated on the coast areas, in either the Chesapeake region or in the Georgia and the Savannah region of the United States. But you'll notice that there's a density that continues, but look at the spread of it. So clearly the Missouri Compromise opened the door to the westward migration of the institution. And so this is just an unbelievable level. And when you consider that all of this growth is primarily for cotton, but not all of it, right? If you notice, the concentrations are still there in Maryland and North Carolina and Virginia and South Carolina, for instance, right? Now all of this continues. And so the text gives you the narrative about Celia, and this is kind of, well, it's just an unthinkable thing. She's raped, and she finally has enough. And this is something that's in a number of narratives that you can get to, in the sense that many slave women would try to get out of that scenario, and they would think, and I think would naturally think that if the wife would find out, that it would end, right? But in so many times, in so many scenarios, when the mistress of the plantation was made aware of her husband's indiscretions, she tended to simply resent the slave girl. Many of these marriages in the South were done for convenience and for alliances and for financial security. Many of them were not love relationships, or at least not in the sense of the romantic that was popular in the time period. And so many slave women were unable to find solace with the mistress on these sorts of situations. And the slave girl Celia kills her master. And while it was all perfectly verifiable that her contentions were correct, none of that mattered, and she was hanged for murder. The picture that you see to the left is a daguerreotype. It was taken in South Carolina in 1850 of a slave man simply known as Jack. And then below that you see the cotton harvest time for slaves. And it would be during these times, by the way, in the harvest, when your work day would quite literally be dusk to dawn, with minor breaks in there for food and water. And it's just an unthinkable thing that we would have out there, right? So when we figure out how this works, we get a very distorted concept known as a slave family. And so marriages were illegal. Slave marriages were illegal. So vows had to be written to accommodate such a thing in quote unquote weddings. And this was the vow that, and you pledge to honor and obey till death or separation you do part, because you quite literally had no control over your own destiny. And so the breakup of families and the non-legal nature of it required a more expansive concept of family. And so we get what we refer to as extended kinship. And so if you ever notice, and it's still a part of the African-American community's culture to say things like brother and sister and auntie and uncle, to refer to people who are not necessarily blood related. And this stems from these slave communities where, children and young women and men are going to moved from one place to another, from one state from another, from one region to another, and find themselves dislocated and isolated, who have to figure out a way to fit into a new community. And therefore, everybody becomes your family because it was the only way to make it palatable on any level at all. And so it's in this community that we see the rise of so much of the culture that I just spoke of, and the incorporation of a lot of African religion and other folklore into American life. So you can actually, it's in my opinion, it's very fascinating to study the evolution of Black Christianity in America, and how there is the integration of certain, particularly Western African worship technique and structure into already existing Christian theology and practice. So we're going to see the emergence of the Black churches in the South. It becomes very popular, by the way, to listen to Black ministers, even if you were a white person, because of this incorporation of West African religious practice. And yet, right, many of them are going to be refrained from even being literate, let alone being able to study the Bible. And so the African Episcopalian Methodist Church is going to become very powerful, particularly right after the Civil War. Here you get a great portrait of these were actually slaves of the governor of Mississippi, who are burying one of their members. Notice not in a formal cemetery, but out away from the plantation. And you're getting a view here of something referred to the beck and call method, where somebody in the center of a circle chants out things and then gets responses from his audience. So when we talk about resistance, the photo here is of a Confessions of Nat Turner, which was a rebellion that was in the earlier 1800s. And the most common form of resistance was to run away. And in this year, there are quite a bit of stuff being released about that. There's a great motion picture out now about Harriet Tubman. A very good friend of mine, a professor at Texas A&M, Elizabeth Cobbs, has a book out. It's a historical novel that's based on Harriet Tubman's help that she provided to the United States Union armies by being a spy in the South. It's called the Tubman Command, which I can recommend very highly. And it's in part, I think, because of the 2019 commemoration of the founding of slavery. Running away was the best that most could do, and this was incredibly difficult to do. We're going to talk about this later and about how difficult it was to do. and how it could all be undone. Bounty hunters riding into the northern states and literally collecting people and dragging them back into bondage. Of course, the Underground Railroad attaches with Harriet Tubman here, and this is another unbelievable thing. It was very highly dependent on slave effort, but also the work of Quakers. So, as a reminder, Quakers are a pacifist sect of Christianity that were vehemently opposed to slavery, and as a church were very adamant against it from the very beginnings of its existence. So Quakers, predominantly in Pennsylvania, but also in Maryland and Virginia, were quite willing to engage in the Underground Railroad in order to help slaves get to their freedom. And initially, it was two borders that had to be crossed, either the Mason-Dixon line, which is the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland, or to cross the Ohio River if you were in the West. We will see in later chapters that this is there's going to be let's say a compromise agreement between North and South to toughen the fugitive slave laws in 1850, at which point most runaway slaves are going to have to be transported into Canada, because getting across the Ohio or the Mason-Dixon line ends up not being enough, because the northern states were, after 1850, were held legally responsible to return slaves. So as escape and those sorts of things became more difficult, we see a different form of resistance, sabotage and pacing. And this is because there's unbelievable logic here. And so, unfortunately, there are a lot of negative stereotypes about African Americans that have persisted for over a couple of centuries now, in reference to African Americans that are in large part stem from this form of resistance. And that's because, and I'm sorry, what you have to do is you have to kind of think for yourself for a moment. If you are going to wake up at the crack of dawn and you are going to labor all day long until it's dark, and the next day you're getting up and you're doing it all again, and you're going to do that pretty much 6 days a week and probably 7, or perhaps 6.5. And you're going to do that every day you're alive. And when you're dead, your children are going to do it. And so what you do is what I think is the most logical thing on earth. You figure out a way to be as slow as you possibly can without getting beat. And once you figure out what that pace is, that's what you're doing. And there's no way you're going to go any faster, because it's not like you're going to get paid a bonus for getting something done quicker or doing it faster or being more like entrepreneurial, right? None of that was there. And sabotage was even more brilliant, because a lot of the equipment that Southern plantation owners used for the production of their cotton was done with, was equipment that was built in northern states. So a piece of material or an engine or any kind of a piece of equipment that's broken, it could be weeks before its replacement can arrive, which means that you now suddenly had a vacation. And so this was always, this was always a great avenue. Because the thing was, most Southern whites assumed that African Americans were not very intelligent. So it's not like you were going to get beaten, because they're going to be like, oh, you're just being such an idiot. Oh, I'm sorry, right? And then it's over. So another form was ingratiation. It's important to note that all of the Southern slave rebellions were in some way undermined by other slaves who basically revealed what was happening. This was done in order to get food, better treatment, moved to a better situation. So if you could get moved from the field to a household job, or from the field into a skilled labor position, if you could become the master's valet, which means that you got to travel with him, there were all sorts of things that would give cause to ingratiation. And this was always, possible. Petition was a form of requests for manumission, for better treatment, for keeping families together. And of course, rebellion was the last. Every rebellion that happens in the South, even when we go all the way back to like DeMarc Vesey or the Stono rebellions, which happened in the colonial period, resulted in unbelievable carnage for slaves. Nat Turner's rebellion was the only one that really resulted in a large-scale death of white people. And what it did was, in many ways, to reinforce an already existing fear among the planter families and just, white families, period. And that is that the black slaves were so hateful and resentful of their status that to free them and leave them in America was unfathomable because of the obvious revenge that would be wrought, which would not be an unreasonable thing, in my opinion. But anyhow, this goes all the way back, not just to Stoner's rebellion, but the rebellion that happens on Haiti in the 1790s. When the Haitian slaves rose up against their French masters, they literally killed every white person in Haiti. And the stories and reports that come out of Haiti to the South just terrify them at unbelievable levels. There's going to be a number of movements to end the emancipation of slaves, meaning it will become illegal in most southern states by 1860 to free your slaves. So even if you wanted to free your slaves, there are going to be laws in some states to prevent you from doing that because of this growing fear that these rebellions were going to lead to unfathomable bloodshed of white persons. And so what I've done here is to try to bring you into this community, if you will, or these two communities, but also to try to understand how they are in many ways codependent. When we get into the 1850s, Southern blacks are illiterate. They are imprisoned. They are restricted in what they can know and what they can practice. So even for the runaway slave, it's not necessarily going to be a good life. And so many will become despondent and yet sort of acquiesce to their state. And the white communities of the South are unbelievably codependent on their slaves. And while they have this position of power and unbelievable violent domination, without these slaves, they are done. There was quite literally a need and a perceived need. And you get out of this a very sick and twisted reality. In a earlier version of the Tindall and Shi book, the Not the Brief edition, but they talk about something that we'll bring up again. And that is that slavery and race had a very interesting, diabolical, and bizarre effect on Americans. Because when you read this section and you look at what's going on in the South, there is a natural response that says, why didn't Northerners just go in and get rid of this problem? Why didn't they just, do what John Brown did and just go down there and hand out guns to all these black slaves and end it, right? All this other stuff. And it's because the racism pervaded everybody. And we get this very bizarre, sick and twisted mindset of a Southern gentleman who would quite literally adore and worship his white children, but also the black mammy that raised him and raised his children. There's this unbelievable bond between white Southerners and selected members of the black community, and yet they would not think twice of beating that person to half a lick of their life and to sell that individual into another plantation. It boggles the human mind. And yet it's somewhat true to say that while the Southerners hated the race but loved the people, Northerners loved the race but hated the people. And this put Africans in unbelievable lose-lose situations because there were so few gentle souls willing to look past the color of their skin and to reach out and offer assistance or empathy or even, education. And this is the status of the antebellum America. And I think that when you read about this material, if you don't have the time for a larger piece, Peter Colchin of the University of Delaware wrote a book on slavery, and it's very small. But it's an excellent reader on it. I believe it's just called Slavery, 1619 to 1865. And if you can find it and get it, it's excellent. I think I read it in like 2 sittings because it really solidifies some of this, and you begin to understand just how deeply entrenched and diabolical and tragic and sad and unbelievable that this is. And so with that, I'm going to close and, thank you very much for your time on what is the saddest part and the most pathetic part of our history.